Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Marie Kato. CIA Director John Ratcliffe made a historic trip to Cuba in recent days and met with the country's Interior Minister Lázaro Álvarez Casas in a bid to signal that the U.S. is ready to provide assistance and support, but only in exchange for the necessary fundamental changes in Cuba, that is. Cuba's energy supplies are almost all gone as U.S. pressure mounts on the Caribbean island nation. Joining us now is Professor Alberto Coll from the DePaul University College of Law. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure.
So just before we begin our conversation, I just wanted to bring in this soundbite from Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
In the case of Cuba, it's a very different situation. There is no economy in Cuba. To the extent there's any wealth in Cuba, it doesn't go to the people, it doesn't even go to the government. The wealth is controlled by a company owned by military generals. They take all the money. They're sitting on billions of dollars. Okay, this is a country where people are literally now eating garbage from the streets, but they have a company that controls all of the money making there that's sitting on $15–16 billion. So it's a broken, non-functional economy, and it's impossible to change it. I wish it were different, but I believe, it's my personal opinion, you cannot change the economic trajectory of Cuba as long as the people who are in charge of it now are in charge of it. That's what's going to have to change, because these people are proven incapable. I hope I'm wrong. We'll give them a chance. But I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think we're going to be able to change the trajectory of Cuba as long as these people are in charge in that regime.
So that's coming from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I'd like to hear from you. How severe is the energy situation in Cuba? How are people surviving? How soon do you think it will become an emergency humanitarian situation?
Well, I think it's important for our viewers to understand that the Cuban economy has been in a very, very profound crisis now for several years, okay? And that even before Mr. Trump announced his oil blockade in January, Cuba already for the past 2 years, throughout 2025, 2024, long before the Trump oil blockade, Cuba was experiencing massive blackouts. National blackouts as well as power blackouts in many, many parts of the country. And these are the result of the fact that their energy grid has not been properly maintained by the Cuban government for the past 40 years. These are old plants built by Russia, by the Soviet Union. They would require massive upgrading, parts which Cuba, if it wanted to pay for them, would pay for them to restore. But you're talking about an investment of anywhere, calculated by economists, between $2 and $16 billion just to get the energy grid, the power plants working. And that has led also to a massive collapse in economic activity. You also have had, for the past 5 years, over 1 million Cubans have left the island. That's 10% of the population. Many of them wound up in the United States, but they've also moved to Latin America, Europe. And that's been a massive exodus, principally of younger people who see no hope for advancement in their own country under the current economic conditions. Economic production has plummeted over the past 5 years. Foreign investment is down to zero. Even China, which politically has very warm relations with Cuba, has not invested in Cuba for the past few years and is not interested in investing in Cuba. And even Russia, which could invest in Cuba, has chosen not to do so, partly also because, of course, they're tied down in their war in Ukraine. So this is a crisis that gradually has built up and which the Cuban government has proved unable and incapable of addressing properly. So how will this all end up? Well, the first factor you have here is the collapse in agriculture. Cuban agriculture has been in crisis now for many, many years. It did not start this year. It's been in crisis for many, many years. Cuba, for the past 10 years, for example, has been importing between 70 and 80% of its food. That's an incredibly high statistics for a country that has wonderful weather, very rich soils, and which could at least grow enough of its food to feed itself across the board, maybe importing maybe 20–25% of it, the wheat, which of course Cuba doesn't grow, and things like rice, which Cuba doesn't grow enough of. But Cuba could feed itself mostly, but instead it imports between 70 and 80% of its food. And that requires foreign currency reserves, which Cuba lacks.
So what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? Are there any obvious conclusions between the meeting between John Ratcliffe and Cuba's interior minister? What's happening next?
Well, so I think the U.S. government gradually is increasing the pressure. And I think, as Secretary of State Rubio pointed out, the message of the U.S. government will be that the U.S. government will continue the pressure on the Cuban government to reform structurally, to make major reforms. And that doesn't mean just allowing Cuban Americans to invest in the island piecemeal basis, or even American companies to invest on the island. The U.S. is talking about major reforms, both economic and political. You know, Cuba does not have a competitive political system. One party and one group of persons has been in control of the island for 67 years. And many Cubans who are very nationalistic and very patriotic, even those Cubans are very tired of having the same group of people run the country for 67 years and running it not very efficiently. So how does this all end up? The U.S. government is increasingly saying either you make truly substantial reforms, which so far the Cuban government has not shown interest in doing, or this will lead to a crisis. And one of the subtle messages I think that John Ratcliffe sent, and this is why the director of the CIA went to Cuba to send this message, is at some point the U.S. may decide to intervene militarily. At some point, the U.S. would prefer not to. That was also the message.
Is it going to be another Venezuela? Do you think it's going to be another Venezuela?
It could be a Venezuelan type of operation, or it could be even a limited intervention in the sense of U.S. forces landing in Cuba, which, you know, is very different from Venezuela. The Cuban military has hardly any fuel to operate its forces. Basically, the Cuban military would collapse in just a few days. It doesn't have any staying power. And so you only have the security services pretty much holding down the country, the restive population. And it would not last very long. But I think the U.S. government would prefer not to do that. But basically the message, unless the Cuban government agrees to drastic reforms, including political and economic reforms, there may be some kind of operation in place to do what might become, from the viewpoint of the U.S., the best option.
There have been reports that Marco Rubio has held secret talks with the Cuban government, but there has been no breakthrough as of yet. Do you know any more details about that? No. Is there a chance?
No, we don't know any more details.
Okay. Is there a chance that Trump has broader desires in regards to Cuba, that he might want to invade Cuba in the way that he has spoken of in regards to Greenland?
Look, the United States is not interested in making a part of the United States. In the Trump administration, even the people who advocated for taking over Greenland, has that in mind. So I don't think that Trump has that in mind either. I think, in fact, what he has in mind is difficult to fathom, but he does have in mind a different Cuba in which economic activity opens up and in which there is political opening of the system. And I think this is not just Trump's view. This is the view of well over a million and a half very influential Cuban American voters in the U.S. who are very influential in the Republican Party. And in fact, they're telling the Trump administration, we're not going to be happy just with the Cuban government allowing American companies and even Cuban to invest. The people in South Florida are pressuring the Trump administration to push the Cuban government into substantial reforms that lead to a new system. The Cuban government, of course, doesn't want to do that. You know, most political elites don't want to commit political suicide. They don't want to leave power. They have a lot of economic control and they benefit enormously from that economic control. So they don't want to leave. And that's where the deadlock is. So, but the U.S., through Marco Rubio and others, have been holding secret negotiations with the people who really run the government. The government is by the Castro family. Raul Castro is still in charge behind the scenes, and by intelligence and security services. President Diaz is basically your head. He doesn't run the Cuban government. The Cuban government is run by people behind him, and that's who the people are that you're talking with. But so far, the Cuban government has shown any willingness to undertake the kinds of drastic reforms, which also would implicate their giving up power. They don't want to give up their economic, their political power. At the same time, the U.S. is saying, well, if you don't do that, this is going to lead to a very bad outcome, because eventually, first of all, the Cuban people may get very tired of this, and there may be a lot of social unrest. And secondly, the United States has numerous options, all the way from a Venezuela-style operation to something more substantial. But again, the goal would not be to turn Cuba 51st U.S. state by no means.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on the situation in Cuba. Okay, Professor Alberto Coll from the DePaul University College of Law, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's all for World Talks right now. Thank you for joining us here on TVP World, and we'll keep you updated with the latest headlines. Goodbye.